Lecture 75, William Butler Yeats.
I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there, of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade. I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore. While I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's gray, I hear it in the deep heart's core. These lines come from a poem called The Lake Isle of Innisfree, first drafted by William Butler Yeats in 1888 when he was 23, and finished sometime before they were published 2 years later. Living in London, Yeats was homesick for his ancestral county of Sligo in the northwest of Ireland, where he spent 2 years of his childhood. As he walked through London's Fleet Street one day and heard a tinkle of water, he discovered that it came from a fountain in a shop window, a jet of water with a little ball balanced on it. This modest little exhibition evidently reminded the poet of lake water, and specifically of a small island called Innisfree in Lough Gill, a lake in County Sligo. So he resolves to go to Innisfree, to build a cabin there, plant beans, keep honeybees, and live alone. His project may remind us of Henry David Thoreau, the American writer that Yeats had been reading at the time he wrote his poem. About 40 years earlier, Thoreau spent the better part of 2 years actually living alone on the edge of Walden Pond near Concord, Massachusetts, where he built a cabin and planted beans. But unlike Thoreau's Walden, which reports on his experiment in living alone by a pond, this poem doesn't lay out a practical plan of action. It expresses a mood of nostalgia, a yearning to revisit an island that rises not so much from the waters of Lough Gill as from a place in the heart of the speaker, the deep heart's core. The phrase evokes the ending of a poem written by Wordsworth some 85 years before. Ruminating on the impact of a song sung by a solitary reaper in the Scottish Highlands, Wordsworth concludes, "The music in my heart I bore, long after it was heard no more." In the deep heart's core of Yeats's poem, which literally echoes the last word of Wordsworth's poem, Yeats's speaker hears the music of a lake that he bears inside him, even as he tramps the gray pavements of a great metropolis. Now, you'll notice here that I mentioned the speaker of Yeats's poem. You know, whenever you find the pronoun I in a work of literature, you're naturally inclined to identify it with the author, the man or woman who wrote the words that you're reading. But sometimes it's a character distinct from the author, just as the characters who speak in a play are distinct from the playwright who created them. In other words, even when you find the pronoun I in a lyric poem like this one, you can't always assume that the author is speaking for himself. In recalling the circumstances that led him to write this poem, Yeats tells us about the fountain in the shop window, and we have no reason to doubt that story. But when he creates a speaker who resolves to go to Innisfree, Yeats is not giving us his travel plans. While living in London and planning to stay there for the time being, he's imagining someone who would act on what the poet feels, who would physically go and settle down on the island of Innisfree. But in the last 3 lines of the poem, the tense becomes present and the speaker merges with the poet. To alleviate his homesickness, the poet need not book a trip to Innisfree. He need only tap into the core of his feelings right now by writing the poem. By the time Yeats wrote it, he had grown up traveling back and forth between England and Ireland, which then belonged to Great Britain, and which was ruled from London for most of Yeats's life. Born in Dublin in 1865, he was the eldest child of a middle-class Anglo-Irish family. His father practiced law before giving it up to study painting in London, where he moved his family when the future poet was just 2 years old. When the boy was 7, his mother, Susan Mary Yeats, took him and his 3 new siblings off to Sligo, where they stayed for 2 years. They then returned to London, and at the age of 12, William entered the Godolphin School in Hammersmith, an obscene, bullying place, he later called it, where pretentious little English dimwits sneered at what one of them called a mad Irishman. None of them could have foreseen that he would eventually become the greatest Irish poet of his time. En route to that end, of course, he needed more schooling. After 4 years at Godolphin, Yeats moved with the family back to Dublin, where he entered a high school that proved much more receptive to his talents. At 17, he began writing poetry, and 2 years later published his first poems in the Dublin University Review. In the meantime, he briefly studied painting in Dublin, returned to live in London with the rest of his family, and launched what is now seen as the first phase of his poetic career. Like the Lake Isle of Innisfree, the poems of this period radiate nostalgia and longing for something imagined as much as remembered. Challenging the scientific rationalism of his day, Yeats's early poems use Irish myth and folklore to reconfirm what he called the ancient supremacy of imagination. In Yeats's first phase, nothing exemplifies this supremacy more than Fergus, the legendary Irish poet and king, who gave up his throne at the behest of a druid to spend his time hunting in the woods. In just 2 stanzas, Yeats imagines Fergus piercing the deep wood's woven shade to find a world of elemental beauty and peace. For Fergus rules the brazen cars, and rules the shadows of the wood, and the white breast of the dim sea, and all disheveled, wandering stars. Several lines from this hauntingly beautiful poem are echoed in Joyce's Ulysses, and the poem as a whole remains a lasting specimen of Yeats's Celtic lyricism. But just as Fergus leaves his kingdom behind, Yeats himself soon realized that poetry of this kind was escapist, too lyrical, he called it, too full of aspirations after remote things, too full of desires. By 1903, when he wrote those words, Yeats had resolved to put behind him the ornate aestheticism that marked his work of the 1890s. Yet even as Yeats strove to shake himself free of aesthetic ornaments, he knew that he could not make poetry without some calculation, some resort to artifice, however subtle. In the poem called Adam's Curse, written in 1902, he meditates on both love and the labor demanded by art. He speaks in this poem to Maud Gunn, a ravishingly beautiful Irish nationalist whom he had known and loved for more than 10 years, but who had repeatedly refused to marry him, though she briefly let him into her bed 6 years after he wrote this poem. In the poem itself, he recreates a conversation held one evening in late summer between himself and Maud's sister Kathleen, with Maud listening in. Talking of poetry, the poet tells the women that a line will take us hours, maybe, but that all such time is wasted unless the line sounds improvised and spontaneous. This is the paradox of poetic creation. Putting sweet sounds together, says the poet, is harder than scrubbing floors or breaking stones, but most men of the workaday world think of poets as idlers. When Kathleen answers that women likewise must labor to be beautiful, the poet says, "It's certain there is no fine thing since Adam's fall, but needs much laboring." Just as Adam was cursed with having to work for a living when he and Eve were expelled from paradise, all men and women must toil for anything they seek, including love. But the poem doesn't stop there. It takes a fresh turn. Recalling old-time lovers who courted their ladies with the aid of quotations plucked from old books, the poet tells the women that such learned courting seems an idle trade enough, by which he seems to mean that even he finds it idle. This, in turn, leads him to a final thought as he contemplates the washed-out shell of a moon above them and silently speaks to his beloved Maud. "I had a thought for no one's but your ears, that you were beautiful, and that I strove to love you in the old highway of love, that it had all seemed happy, and yet we'd grown as weary-hearted as that hollow moon." Here I think we can safely identify the speaker of the poem with Yeats himself, especially since the speaker identifies himself as a poet. It helps to know that neither he nor his beloved are young. He's a bachelor of 37. She, age 36, has already been married once and has borne 2 illegitimate children, one of them dead for more than 10 years. But Yeats's love for Maud never died. And in the final lines of the poem, he sees the two of them with double vision. On the one hand, he sees himself as an old-fashioned lover courting his lady in learned, fancy phrases. On the other hand, he feels that both of them are weary-hearted as the hollow moon, empty, drained, exhausted, mere shells of the people they once were. If it is true that no fine thing can be made without much laboring, as the poet says earlier, it is equally true that labor alone cannot ensure the creation of any fine thing, be it the beauty of a poem or a beautiful woman's love. This is the final twist to Adam's curse. Like all of Adam's descendants, the artist is doomed to work. But for the creation of art, work is at once indispensable and insufficient. Soon after Yeats wrote Adam's Curse, Maud Gonne married another man, an Irish revolutionary named John McBride. Dismayed and heartsick, Yeats wrote almost no poetry at all for 5 years and buried himself in action. He spent several months lecturing in America. Then, aiming to make the theatre a place of intellectual excitement, he founded and directed the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, which flourishes to this very day. He had already caused a stir with a play of his own, The Countess Kathleen, mounted by the New Irish Literary Theatre in 1899. Brilliantly played by Maud Gonne, its title character sells her soul to the devil in order to buy food for the starving Irish poor. Though the play provoked outcries against its unorthodoxy, Yeats did not shrink from lighting more dramatic fires with the plays that he put on the stage of the Abbey. In 1907, after John Millington Synge's Playboy of the Western World sparked riots, Yeats denounced the hidebound thinking of the Irish middle classes. Boldly articulating what might be called an aristocratic view of art, he defended the right of the individual mind to see the world in its own way, to cherish the thoughts which separate from one another and that are the creators of distinguished life, instead of those thoughts that had made one man like another if they could. Yeats believed that his mercenary, moralistic, pietistic contemporaries had forsaken the ideals for which the great Irish nationalists like Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone had given their lives more than 100 years earlier. He voiced these thoughts in a poem written 6 years after the death of another Irish nationalist whom he greatly admired as his political mentor, John O'Leary. In the poem, called simply September 1913, Yeats ties O'Leary's death to the death of nationalism, and he scornfully addresses the Catholic commercial classes. What need you, being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till, and add the halfpence to the pence, and prayer to shivering prayer, until you have dried the marrow from the bone? For men were born to pray and save. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. This poem sends conflicting messages about what became of Yeats in his second phase. On the surface, it seems regressive. 10 years after renouncing a poetry of nostalgic yearning and escapism, Yeats mourns the passing of romantic Ireland, a vanished ideal. But this poem does not fly to an enchanted Celtic past. It grips the Ireland of the poet's own time in words that are blunt, gritty, and mostly monosyllabic. You have dried the marrow from the bone. The poem laments great Irish heroes, but it calls them dead and gone. Rather than taking us back to the ideal glory of the past, the poem bitterly confronts the grim reality of the present. As such, it exemplifies what happened to Yeats's poetry in its second phase. As he himself explains in the poem called A Coat, his earlier poetry was like a coat that had to be discarded. I made my song a coat, covered with embroideries, out of old mythologies from heel to throat. But the fools caught it, wore it in the world's eye, as though they'd wrought it. Song, let them take it, for there's more enterprise in walking naked. To understand what Yeats means by the fools, it helps to know that he was specifically reacting to what had been recently said of him by another Irish writer named George Moore. In the first volume of Moore's fictionalized memoirs, published in 1911, he caricatured Yeats as a literary fop all dressed up in the pseudo-Celtic embroidery. Moore imagined Yeats eternally caught in his first phase, the phase of ornamented title pages, Celtic myth, fancy rhyme schemes, nostalgia, and escapism. But Yeats had long since shed those trappings like an old coat. Let the fools take it, he says, but there's more enterprise in walking naked. Throughout his career, Yeats fought the temptation to settle into any one coat, any one style, any one fixed way of seeing or speaking. Nearly 50 when he wrote these words. He was rejuvenating himself in terms both ancient and new. More than 100 years earlier, in a poem or prophecy called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, the outbreak of the French Revolution led William Blake, the first of the English Romantic poets, led William Blake to say that he was stripping off his former beliefs. Like the risen Christ discarding his grave clothes, Blake was casting off old doctrine in order to proclaim the return of Adam into paradise, the return to something like the nakedness that came before the fall of man in the book of Genesis. Now, I can't say for sure whether or not Yeats's decision to go naked owes anything to Blake, but we do know that for years before writing this poem, Yeats had steeped himself in Blake's poetry. So it's at least possible that Yeats may have borrowed his metaphor from Blake, who in turn evokes the oldest myth we have in Western culture. But even though this poem may well evoke an ancient myth, it also marks Yeats's entry into the world of modernism. Modernism takes various forms. In some of the other lectures, especially the one on Kafka, I define modernism as a way of thinking and feeling that spotlights the individual isolated self. Cut off from traditional beliefs and institutions, the isolated self dominates the fiction of writers such as Conrad, Faulkner, Kafka, and Virginia Woolf. As applied to poetry, modernism spotlights the naked object as much as the isolated self. Where earlier poetry often clothes the object in layers of abstract thought and sentiment, modernism strips them away, leaving the object to speak for itself in what Ezra Pound called the hard light of sharp visualization and concrete presentation. Yeats came to modernism partly through the urging of Pound, Ezra Pound, the young American poet who greatly admired Yeats and soon won his admiration in turn. Though he was 20 years younger than the 48-year-old Yeats, Pound pressed him forward into modernism and in particular helped him to make his language more precise and concrete. In shedding the clothes of rumination and sentiment, modernism also shucked the corset of regular versification, unlaced the stays of uniform rhyme and meter. Some modernist poetry, including much of Ezra Pound's, is written in free verse, verse with neither rhyme nor meter, free to sound like prose. Yeats never went this far, but in A Coat you can certainly see him loosening the stays of rhyme and meter. While the first 4 lines give us regular rhyme in the order ABBA, coat, embroideries, mythologies, throat, the next 6 lines give us just one regular rhyme, caught it and wrought it. The other rhymes are irregular, I and enterprise, take it and naked. As for the meter, the pattern of syllables and accents, it's anything but regular. The poem leads off with a 3-beat line of 6 syllables in iambic meter, where the stress falls on the second syllable of each pair. I made my song a coat, ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. But line 2 has 7 syllables and makes us stress the very first one, covered with embroideries. Notice, too, the 4th line, which shrinks to just 4 syllables, from heel to throat. The straitjacket of regular versification no longer binds the poet. Unadorned by uniform rhyme and meter, the poem itself walks naked with a bold, unpredictable gait. Reinforcing this modernist focus on the naked object, stripped of abstraction, sentiment, and the tight-laced corset of strict versification, Yeats's poetry in this second phase shows him grappling directly with the political upheaval of his own time. In September 1913, the poem of that title, as we have seen, he's caught between past and present, mourning the vanished glory of a romantic Ireland while facing the grim reality of a mercenary land of the greasy till. But 3 years later, he was electrified by an event that he knew would profoundly change his country. On Easter Monday in 1916, a force of about 900 nationalists announced the birth of the Irish Republic. Seizing the post office and other key sites in Dublin, they held out for 6 days before surrendering to British forces, who executed 15 of their leaders, including John MacBride, the now estranged husband of Maud Gonne. Quite apart from the fact that MacBride's death revived Yeats's hopes of marrying Maud at last, the Easter Rising left him feeling intensely conflicted. On the one hand, he had always opposed violent rebellion and despised the fanaticism of its leaders. On the other hand, in September 1913, he had recently chided his countrymen for turning their backs on the self-sacrificing heroism of old Irish nationalists. Given his lament for the passing of what he called romantic Ireland, how could he fail to applaud this dramatic evidence of its rebirth right before his very eyes? Yeats felt bound to voice his admiration in a poem called Easter 1916, which ends by saluting all who died for the dream of Irish independence, even the drunken, vainglorious lout who had married Maud Gonne. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonagh and MacBride, and Connolly and Pearse, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed, changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Yeats clearly saw that even though the British had executed the leaders of the Easter Rising, they could not kill the newborn hope for independence, could not crush the terrifying beauty of a bloody revolution that would eventually and inevitably liberate Ireland from British rule. Sensing the imminence of radical change in the political landscape of his country, Yeats felt a powerful need for renewal in his personal life. But for a time he was balked. During a 3-month stay with Maud Gonne in Normandy, he proposed to her one last time. When she turned him down again, he started courting her 22-year-old daughter, Iseult, who gave him no more reason to hope than her mother had. Chagrined, he returned to Ireland and wrote an elegy for himself, The Wild Swans at Coole. Inspired by the swans at Coole Park, the country estate of his longtime friend and patron, Lady Gregory, this poem was written in the autumn of 1916. At twilight, watching a large flock of swans paddling around the pond at Coole Park, the 51-year-old poet remembers first seeing and counting them there 19 years earlier, when they suddenly flew up and scattered, wheeling in great broken rings. But now, he says, all's changed within him. The persistence of the swans' vitality and of their devotion to each other makes the poet feel heartsick and weary, makes him feel that he has totally changed since he first heard the swans beating their wings over his head. This is not the change of revolutionary renewal celebrated in the poem about the Easter Rising. It is rather the shift from life to death in the poet's own heart. Yet at this very nadir of emotional exhaustion, Yeats contrived to rejuvenate himself. In the fall of 1917, after proposing in vain to Iseult, he married a woman less than half his age named George Hyde Lees. Shortly after the wedding, she introduced him to something called automatic writing, a method of composition in which the hand is supposedly moved by mysterious forces beyond control of the conscious mind. For Yeats, this kind of writing proved, in his own words, an incredible experience. Though he never picked up any clear message from the mysterious source, he felt inspired to build what he called a system of symbolism, and his poetry henceforth gained a new power of imagination and vision. As if to signify that new power, he bought a literal vantage point in 1917, Thor Ballylee, a Norman tower in County Galway that he restored and made his summer home. What then should we make of this move? Was Yeats simply withdrawing from the violence of his own time, escaping into the past, nostalgically returning to the half-mythical, half-legendary world of his first phase? The answer is both yes and no. Yeats never claimed to speak for the common man or woman, and ever since traveling to Italy with Lady Gregory in 1908 and witnessing the achievements of the Renaissance, he had thought of art as an enterprise for aristocrats, or for great artists nurtured by aristocratic patrons. For Yeats, in other words, the artist was a being apart, someone who looked at the world with an historical consciousness and a sense of prophetic vision. But viewing the world in this way did not mean turning back to the Celtic myths and fairy twilight of Yeats's first phase. It meant seeing the world in all its rage and chaos and seizing the meaning of its moment in the great cycles of history. What, for instance, could he say about the 8.5 million men slaughtered in the First World War? What could he say about the years right after that war, when Ireland was embroiled in its own war with England? Yeats neither ignores that war, nor takes up rhetorical arms on behalf of his country, much as he admired its heroes. He never became a propagandist for any cause or used his poems as tools of persuasion. Out of the quarrel with others, he wrote, we make rhetoric, but of the quarrel with ourselves, poetry. To make poetry in a time of violence, Yeats had to quarrel with his own impulse to join the fight for Irish independence. He had to read this conflict as the sign that a great cycle of history was coming to an end. He called each cycle of history a gyre, by which he meant an age or era that might last for 2,000 years. In the nearly 2 millennia since the birth of Christ, he thought, the gyre was sweeping outward to its point of greatest expansion, and the result was anarchy. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. As prophesied by John in the book of Revelation, the second coming of Christ is a time of judgment, a time of destruction and renewal heralded by the advent of a gigantic beast, the beast of the apocalypse. Contemplating the anarchy of his own time, Yeats envisions a creature something like an Egyptian sphinx, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, treading the desert sands. Remembering that the ancient world was radically changed by the birth of Christ, that it was vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, the poet finally asks of his own time, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? Steeped in biblical prophecy and airlifted by abstractions like anarchy and revelation, the poem is emphatically visionary. Yet its language shows us that Yeats can still cast his objects in the hard, clear light of earthbound specificity. The infant Christ is signified by a rocking cradle, and the new beast of the apocalypse slouches toward Bethlehem, a brilliantly vivid word for its bizarre fusion of brutishness and sloth. Between the writing of this poem in 1920 and the death of his friend and patron, Lady Gregory, in 1932, Yeats produced some of his most visionary work, including the poems of Byzantium, where he imagines himself leaving behind the sensual music of these dying generations and losing himself in the artifice of eternity, in the timeless works of mosaic art depicting the martyrdom of the saints. But Yeats made his own art timeless by periodically rejuvenating himself. In his final phase, the last 4.5 years of his life, he not only completed his autobiography and edited the Oxford Book of Modern Verse, he also produced 4 new plays, a batch of essays, and more than 70 poems. Lean, muscular, and often abrasive, these late poems radiate an astounding vitality. In one of the best of them, The Circus Animal's Desertion, he chides himself for having conducted a vain sideshow of poetic metaphors, and he freshly resolves to school himself once more in the gritty facts of life here on earth. Talking about the mythical imagery of his plays as well as the metaphors of his poems, he concludes, "Those masterful images, because complete, grew in pure mind, but out of what began? A mound of refuse, or the sweepings of a street, old kettles, old bottles, and a broken can, old iron, old bones, old rags, that raving slut who keeps the till. Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart." Yeats remained his own toughest critic. Long after winning the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1923, he was still reinventing himself, rebuilding his poetic language, recreating his art. He died in January 1939, just 7 months before the outbreak of the Second World War. But in the body of work he has left us, he reveals the undying life of his self-renewing imagination.